Imagine that you've descended into a spooky, dark cave. Your loved ones have been trying to talk you out of this dangerous idea, but they can't even imagine the thrills it gives you. Under the ground, you find yourself as if in some other dimension, with its stunning play of light and dark, stalactites hanging from the ceiling, and crystal clear water of the underground lakes. But there's something else waiting for you here, something you don't see at the beginning, and that something is death. In addition to the obvious hazards, such as falling or a landslide, you may die from freezing, drowning, and even drug poisoning. In this video, I'll tell you the scariest stories that have happened to adventure seekers. Some had to pay with their lives for the desire to top their own records, and some used their last breath to scribble a death note with their finger in the sand as the consequence of ignoring safety rules. Today, we'll find out why you should never enter caves. The greatest danger during cave exploration lies in them having such convoluted labyrinths, abysses, and ravines that if anything were to happen, you probably wouldn't even be rescued. Especially if you're heading for Riesending, the deepest and the longest cave system in Germany. Because of its massive size, it's virtually impossible to find a lost speleologist in the tunnels. This became clear after a search and rescue operation that took place in 2014. It featured 700 participants and cost about 960,000 euros. Then, on June 7th, cave explorer Johann Westhauser entered the cave with his colleagues. He was far from being an amateur. In fact, he was one of the people who discovered the Riesending tunnel system back in 1995. That's why the man was as good at finding his way around the cave as anyone could possibly be. The expedition's goal was to find the place where this system conjoined to another 80-kilometer-long tunnel consisting of around 4,000 caves in neighboring Austria. No one knew exactly where the passage was, so Johann's exploration was supposed to become a sensation. On the inside, Riesending was just stunning. Nevertheless, passing through this cave is physically and psychologically challenging. The explorers had to move along its wet, slippery rock corridors, squeeze into narrow cracks filled with water, and, since some of the cave's passages were vertical, they had to employ their rock climbing skills as well. During this difficult journey, they slipped on the slimy stones and often closely avoided landslides, one of which caused one of the speleologists to start panicking and nearly bring the entire team to ruin. Eventually, though, the scientists reached the coveted explored area where the cave conjoined with another. But the explorer's joy was short-lived. At some point, Johann got hit by the collapsing rock, and one of the giant boulders punctured his helmet. The speleologist went unconscious and disappeared under the debris. He was barely alive, and his colleagues realized they'd be unable to get Johann out by themselves, and a rescue team would be unlikely to successfully go on the arduous journey to save the man. Still, the cave explorers decided to take a risk. One of them stayed with the injured Johann, and another started making his way back to ask for help. Only in 10 hours, he reached the cave entrance. Right away, the speleologist called the mountain rescue service, and, to his surprise, his plea wasn't rejected. 11 rescue workers devised a plan, gathered everything they needed, and 2 days after Johann entered the cave, they went to save him. This task was virtually insurmountable since the scientists themselves had just barely made it through the cave's narrow passages. And now, the rescue team had to squeeze a stretcher for the injured, and a lot of other necessary things through this same pathway. Nevertheless, on June 11th, there was a doctor by Johann's side. He diagnosed the man with light traumatic brain injury, but said there was hope of getting him out of this trap alive. Meanwhile, more and more people were joining the rescue effort, and approximately 70% of Bavaria's mountain rescue services equipment was used in the operation. On June 19th, Johann was saved and brought to a hospital by an airplane. The cave explorer spent around 2 weeks at a trauma center, had surgery, and then underwent rehabilitation that lasted for a few months. After this incident, the cave entrance was closed, and now only well-trained scientists are allowed there, strictly in cases of absolute necessity. Johann's story became legendary among speleologists. He was very lucky to have so many people extending efforts to save his life. A similar situation happened in 1965. in Ohio's Wildcat Cave. 16 teenagers and 3 teachers from Methodist Children's Home in Berea were visiting a park in the Hinckley Reservation. 15-year-old Morris Baetzold had already explored Wildcat Cave in this area, so he gathered a group of friends and went there. Although the tunnel entrance was over 4.5 meters wide, it was only a meter in height. The entrance was followed by a narrow passage which stretched for about 24 meters, then opening into a bigger room. The teenagers crawled through the tunnels and then squeezed through an opening of only around 30 centimeters. Morris knew the entire route almost by heart. Yet at some point, he took a wrong turn and ended up in a tunnel that went down abruptly. Morris crawled into a narrow crack that suddenly opened into a passageway with a 15-degree slant. Because of this, he was now buried almost upside down in pitch-black darkness. The boy couldn't break out of the trap as one of his arms was stuck under his body. His friends tried to reach Morris, but he was over 3 meters deep. So the boys went to get help. One of the teachers tried to make a loop out of his belt to then wrap around the boy's legs and get him out. It didn't work. The belt snapped in half, and Morris fell right back into the crack. Then, the teacher called the firefighters. They wrapped a safety rope around Morris's body, but this also failed. Then, the firefighters tried to raise the boy by hooking onto his jacket, only for the jacket to get torn. At this point, the hope for a quick rescue was completely gone. More and more rescuers started flocking to the site. They installed a power generator, as well as brought electricity and a radiator into the cave, as closer to nighttime, the temperature was supposed to hit 0 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, the news of the incident spread around town, and soon, the reservation was flooded by reporters, volunteers, and the simple folk who wanted to help. When the boy had gone 24 hours without food and water, the rescuers welcomed the U.S. Air Force with the team of the National Speleological Society in Washington. They found a fitting person who was short enough to get into the crack, and that was Michael Ulrich, a 15-year-old Boy Scout. Since he was a child like Morris, Michael was very nervous, but he bravely crawled to the victim and tied a rope around his legs. Then, Morris was finally released from his trap. Nevertheless, people haven't learned from these terrifying incidents, and similar things have happened again, more than once. But the other adventure hunters weren't always lucky enough to survive. Another horrible story happened in New Jersey, which is famous for its numerous caves. In March of 1982, a state police sergeant named Donald, who was a passionate speleologist, decided to take a group of Boy Scouts on a cave exploring adventure. 2 of the teenagers were his sons. Donald chose the Crooked Swamp Cave, the longest in the state. It reaches about 381 meters in length. This cave is special because it's made up of tunnels where you have to literally crawl on your belly. The children went through the narrow passages effortlessly, but the same task posed a problem for Donald. In one of the tunnels, at a depth of 4.6 meters, he got stuck. The children spent an hour trying to get him out before deciding to call for help. But the tunnel Donald was stuck in had an angle, so all attempts at getting him out were pretty much hopeless. Because of the slant, the man's blood circulation was poor. Apart from that, the air in the cave was getting colder, and in the evening, the temperature dropped to 13 degrees Celsius. Despite this, Donald still tried to keep up the good spirits, made jokes, and asked to tell his wife he'd be home by night. When the rescue team arrived, they wrapped a rope around Donald's legs and started pulling. This caused rocks to start falling from the walls. One of the boulders fell on the victim and pressed him even deeper into the tunnel. With time, Donald's positive attitude evaporated. His replies became less frequent, and eventually, he went unconscious due to hypothermia. In 12 hours after he'd entered the cave, Donald gave off his last sigh and became unresponsive. Then the rescuers called 2 girls who were speleology enthusiasts and had a slender build to the site. Nevertheless, they only managed to reach Donald's legs. Upon checking his pulse, they found there was none. Still, in the case of hypothermia, blood is concentrated in the vitally important organs, which can weaken the pulse in the extremities. So, the rescuers did not give up. They decided to take extreme measures. to drill a hole in the wall to get to Donald. But when they finally got to the victim, they realized there really was no pulse. The man was dead. This trip became an absolute nightmare for the scouts and Donald's family. As strange as it may sound, cold is one of the most frequent causes of death in caves. But it's far from being the only one. The only thing scarier than cold in a cave is its icy underground lakes. For example, Leakey Cave, located in Yorkshire Dales National Park in the UK, has over 10 kilometers of tunnels, and in most of them, you'll be walking up to your neck in cold water. That's why it has an official British rating of 5 points, the highest degree of difficulty. All because it's the bed of a river called Mossdale Beck, which flows into the cave entrance and then just disappears. Where it disappears is one of the biggest mysteries in the speleological community. On June 24, 1967, a group of 10 explorers entered the caves in the hope of solving the mystery. The speleologists divided into 2 teams. The first one consisted of 6 very experienced cave explorers, while the second one was made up of simple tourists who just wanted to have a look around the cave. After a while, the second group returned to the surface, but the first group was nowhere to be found. In addition, it started to rain, which no one had seen coming. Yet the water level in the cave remained the same, and no one was panicking, although they should have been. At that moment, the experienced speleologists from the first group were crawling through a tunnel up to their necks in water, all for the sake of their research. With time, though, the rain turned into a real storm, and the water kept flooding. Luckily, one of the tourists on the surface was strolling near the cave and saw that the entrance was entirely flooded. The girl ran to get help right away. A bit later, rescuers and volunteers arrived at the site. They had to dig a massive drainage ditch and build a dam to fully stop the river's flow. With the rescue operation underway, the speleologists tried to escape the flooded cave by themselves. One of them, Johann Ogden, found a crack in the ceiling that could serve as an air pocket, but it was too tiny, and his colleagues wouldn't have fit in there. With horror, he realized his teammates were drowning just a few meters below him, and he couldn't help them at all. The water kept rising, and in the end, the crack began gradually filling up with water. At this time, the rescuers used 19 fire pumps, and the water started to finally go down. But when the rescue squad made it into the cave, all 6 speleologists were already dead. To this day, the Mossdale caving disaster remains the most terrible in the history of Britain. But what can be more dangerous than an ordinary cave, if not an underwater one? On September 29, 1984, a speleologist named Peter, accompanied by 2 friends, arrived at the Sterkfontein Caves to do some scuba diving in its underground lake. All of them descended together and held on to the safety rope to avoid getting lost. Peter was the least experienced one, and he kept letting go of the rope to take a peek at the side caves they were passing by. It irritated his friends immensely, as every time he got lost somewhere, they had to follow him to stay together. Eventually, when the man lagged behind his friends again, they realized they'd lost him. After a long search, they returned to the surface to ask for help. At the same time, Peter was desperately looking for the way back, as he was running out of oxygen. Then, he miraculously happened upon an air pocket, and later, he swam into some room with a little island. There, the exhausted Peter fell asleep. After he woke up, he saw that help wasn't there. It wasn't there the following day, and the day after that. Peter was constantly hungry, and time after time, he didn't even understand whether he was asleep or unconscious due to hunger. The man didn't even know how long he'd spent in this trap. Hoping someone would find this room at some point, Peter started scribbling a message on the sand with his finger. Meanwhile, many rescuers were combing through the cave's tunnels, but there were too many passages. Peter was found only in 6 weeks. He looked extremely exhausted. His bones were literally visible through his pale skin. The rescuers rushed to the man, but it was too late. Peter had starved to death after 3 lonely weeks of suffering. In the sand near the man's body, there was a message to his wife and mother saying, "I love you." But this isn't even the scariest story about dying in a cave. In the years from 1958 till 2000, Wojciech Szymanowski explored an incredible number of caves around the entire European continent, each time choosing increasingly dangerous places. His adventurous hobby peaked at the trip to the flooded cave system in Bourg-Saint-Andéol, France, in April of 2005, where Wojciech was planning to do something incredible in the Goule de la Tonnerie. It stretches horizontally for 600 meters and reaches over 9 meters in depth. It becomes even deeper, but no one can even measure just how deep it goes. So, this is where Wojciech was planning to top his own depth record and dive to almost 122 meters into the cave lake. Wojciech took a rebreather with him, which helps divers breathe underwater, and 2 extra gas tanks, one filled with oxygen, the other with Trimix. When going to great depths, divers usually use this mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. If you balance the Trimix elements incorrectly, you may feel a bit tipsy or tired. But if you use oxygen instead of Trimix, the effect will be much worse. Wojciech was sure his gear would protect him from unexpected situations, but it turned out to be the opposite. The equipment made the diver's mass greater than he'd planned, and it became harder to go down a narrow tunnel. Wojciech carefully pushed his gas tanks and gear forward, trying not to raise the mud so that it wouldn't spoil the visibility. After hitting the depth of 65.5 meters, the man found himself in even bigger trouble. He noticed that for some reason, the mind-altering effect of Trimix was stronger than usual. He must have gotten the proportions wrong. His brain seemed to be in some kind of fog. The diver was overtaken by weakness and disorientation. He felt his body quickly descend and finally hit the bottom. But Wojciech had no time to celebrate beating his own record. Now, at a depth of 110 meters, barely able to breathe, the diver was struggling to switch to the extra oxygen tank. He could hardly control his movements due to the drunkenness-like effect. But after a few attempts, he managed to do it. Wojciech was saved. Yet the effect of Trimix made his lips immobilized, and the mouthpiece fell out from between his teeth. Everything happened so fast, and Wojciech didn't even notice when he started to inhale water. Very soon, it filled the diver's airways, and he died. Sometimes, when it seems like you've considered everything down to the smallest detail, things still do not go according to plan, since cave tourism, and even more so, cave diving, are highly dangerous activities, and you never know exactly what will go wrong. Did you know that natural caves aren't the only ones that can be deadly? In 2017, an 18-year-old brother and a 17-year-old sister were relaxing at a sandy beach in Toms River, New Jersey. The teenagers came up with a strange entertainment activity. They started digging a hole in the sand. At first, they did it just for fun, digging with just their hands. And later, they started using a frisbee. In this way, they dug an almost 3-meter hole. The boy felt like it wasn't enough, so he jumped into the well and continued digging. But the sand held well only when it was wet. And the moment it dried up, the whole walls started crumbling and collapsed, falling on the boy. A great mass of sand fell on his chest, obstructing his breathing. The boy was frantic, trying to inhale at least a bit of air, but eventually suffocated and died. And what horrible cave incidents happened to people you know? Write in the comments, and for the love of God, take care of yourself. For this, subscribe to my channel, where you'll learn about many different hobbies that are more dangerous than they appear.